rather brief, and he's asked for me to make it brief. I'm Joanne Ciulla from the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and I want to welcome you all to what I think will be a fascinating evening. One of the things you have to do when you introduce somebody is to say, who is this person? And I want to answer two questions in this brief introduction. First, who is Bill Moyers, and why are we so happy to have him with us tonight? Bill Moyers, I first saw Bill Moyers on one of his programs when I started teaching philosophy, and he was interviewing Mortimer Adler. And the thing that struck me about this was, I was watching, I'm a philosopher, I was watching this interview, and I realized, my God, you know, this reporter is getting the best of Mortimer Adler. And I was very impressed by him, and then I thought, well, who is this guy? And then I realized that this is the Bill Moyers, who was the Deputy Director of the Peace Corps, Special Assistant to President Johnson. He's the Bill Moyers who was born in Oklahoma. He was a cub reporter for the Marshall News Messenger at the age of 16. He was a graduate of the University of Texas and also has a Master's of Divinity from Southwestern Divinity School. He's also, as we see him today, the winner of over 20 awards from the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. He's done a number of series, and probably most of you are familiar with them, shows on a variety of subjects, from creativity to history in the 20th century, to documentaries on the Constitution, on the famous series in Joseph Campbell on the power of myth. He's had a program on minimum wages. And then, related to the theme of this lecture series, he's had programs such as Amazing Grace, The Arab World, Hate on Trial, Genesis. So we're all probably pretty familiar with most of these. After I first saw Bill Moyers, I got very interested in using a lot of videos in his class, and Mr. Moyers has also, as you know, done a number of series of books from his television series, and I was lucky enough to be a part of one of his series, his World of Ideas series. And the one reason why I think all of us are so happy to see Bill Moyers tonight is because of the fact that he knows how to do something that is rare and wonderful. He knows how to engage in the art of conversation, and he knows how to engage us in ideas in a way that hold our attention and in ways that make us want to talk to our friends and neighbors about them. And so I won't talk any longer because I think this is a very special night. So let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Bill Moyers.
Thank you. Thank you for that very enthusiastic welcome, and thank you, Professor Ciulla, for that very generous introduction. I was smiling backstage as you were saying, who is Bill Moyers, because the truth of the matter is when people say of those of us on television, well, he needs no introduction, it really isn't true. And I'll tell you a true story that happened a few years ago. I had been doing a summer series with Charles Kuralt, my late and great friend, a great journalist from North Carolina. And I was also the senior news analyst on the CBS Evening News. And summer ended, and we finished our summer series, and I went from CBS News out to LaGuardia to catch a plane to East Texas to visit my parents. I put my bag in the trunk of the cab. It had the CBS logo on it, you know, the famous blue and black logo, the I. It didn't have my name on it. So the porter looked at it, looked at me, looked at it, looked at me, and he said, "Aren't you on a soap opera?" I started to say yes to CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, but I didn't think Dan would appreciate that. I went on, checked in, was reading the newspaper, the New York Times, waiting for the plane to board, and a woman came up to me and said, "I know you. Who are you?" Flew to Shreveport, Louisiana, the airport nearest my home, was waiting for that same bag, and another woman came up to me and she said, "I just love your work, Mr. Kuralt. But you look different in person from the way you do on television." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, on television I'm fatter and balder." She said, "That's all right, I love you both ways." so much for notoriety. You were very generous. I gave the commencement at Brown a few years ago, and after I'd finished, a young woman who graduated came up to me and said, "Mr. Moyers, you've been in both journalism and government. That makes everything you say twice as hard to believe." I am honored to be here and delighted to have been introduced by Professor Ciulla. In an uncharacteristic burst of prescience some years ago, I spotted Joanne Ciulla as a real comer in the field of ethics and featured her, as she mentioned a moment ago, on my PBS series, A World of Ideas. She was one of the youngest participants in the series and one of the most effective. Even then, she was thinking very hard about the ethical implications of what happens when a market economy transforms democracy into a market society. It's a real difference. She was also examining the new world order of an international culture where business is conducted among a lot of different people from a lot of different cultures who don't share the same business practices and customs. Her recent book on ethics, The Heart of Leadership, has a favored place on the shelf across from my desk of my reference books. She is herself a leader in mapping the territory of ethics in leadership studies, and you are fortunate that she is here at the university on the Jepson faculty, that she, in fact, came here to found the Jepson School. You're also lucky to have at the university another dynamic woman whom I also know. Azizah Al-Hibiri is both a vibrant member of your law school faculty and a leader, like Joanne, far beyond your campus. She's the founder and former president of the Muslim Women's Lawyers for Human Rights and a founding member of the Muslim American Bar Association. And those are just two of her many commitments. A few years ago, I asked Professor Al-Hibiri to participate in our PBS series on the stories of Genesis. She was a star. People talking to me about the series even now still quote her comments on Abraham, the patriarch, whom three great faiths claim as a founding father. Someone else in the discussion had made the point that because Abraham was chosen, he was put into a different moral category, one that allowed him to get away with behavior that doesn't belong in everyday morality, like pulling a scam on Pharaoh, hiding behind his wife's skirts, and shading the truth occasionally. Abraham could not have asked for a more articulate or eloquent defender than Azizah Al-Hibiri. She brought the group up, I remember this moment, she brought the group up with a start when she announced very forcefully, "We should not be sitting here in judgment over Abraham because we didn't go through what he went through." She reminded us that perfection is not the measure of our humanity, and it is not the measure of God's law. She pointed out that the Quran teaches, as do the Jewish and Christian scriptures, that God can extend his grace to whomever God wishes, even to the most sinful. So by talking openly about her faith before a large national audience, Azizah did a great deal in those discussions to introduce Islam to a large American populace. And I knew that we were kindred spirits when she said, "Now don't think that submitting to God is abdicating responsibility. We have the concept that you read the Quran, you do all of your homework to prepare yourself for understanding the Quran, and then you interpret it for yourself." Sounds like a good Baptist to me. So I am glad to be here among people I know at a university I respect on a beautiful campus like this. I am sure that no one in this audience has failed to note that we are on the dawn of a new millennium. What may have escaped your attention 2 weeks ago was the warning from the FBI to police chiefs all across the country that the arrival of the next millennium could be a catalyst for violence. According to the FBI, and this is a direct quote from that report, the volatile mix of apocalyptic religious and conspiracy theories may produce violent acts aimed at precipitating the end of the world as prophesied in the Bible. Apparently, allegedly, FBI agents have found that several individuals tied to extremist groups have been acquiring weapons, storing food and clothing, raising funds, procuring safe houses, preparing compounds, surveying potential targets, and recruiting converts to their cause in preparation for committing terrorism. Some of the zealots belong to a group that calls itself the White Aryan Nation, who believe that white Aryans are God's chosen race. Some are proponents of a black Hebrew a group called Black Hebrews for Israel. Both groups say the FBI may be preparing for a race war to close the millennium. And there are other clandestine groups mentioned in the report, armed with the urgency of the millennium as a motivating factor, who may also, says the FBI, organize to engage in violence toward the U.S. government and its citizens. Now, I didn't find the report surprising. I got a copy of it, read it, but was not surprised by it. When I was in Richmond 2 years ago to speak at the Richmond Forum, I talked even then about how apocalyptic fears were already rising because of the approaching millennium. Pulpits, tabloids, bookstores were even then proclaiming the last days are here again. According to the Associated Press, nearly 1 in 4 adult Christians, upward of 26 million people, expect Christ to return in their lifetimes. And many had already cocked their ears 2 years ago to hear the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, war, plague, famine, and death, galloping toward calamity. And it's not just Christians whose imaginations are aroused. New Age astrologers foretell psychic anguish, earthquakes, economic collapse. Other believers talk of the coming of the anointed Messiah, of the Mahdi, of the 10th Imam, even of the return of Buddha. A small group of neo-Nazis awaits the reappearance of Adolf Hitler, reportedly on his way back at this very moment to Earth from the planet Zero. That should make Patrick Buchanan very happy. Now comes the FBI report, warning that those most likely to perpetrate violence are motivated by religious beliefs relating to the apocalypse. The report, by the way, is the result of a 9-month intelligence gathering effort which was actually called Project Megiddo. Megiddo is a hill in northern Israel that's been the site of many battles throughout history. The Hebrew word Armageddon means hill of Megiddo. And certain religious zealots, believe that this will be the very site of the last conflict in history between good and evil. One portion of the FBI's report is actually devoted to Jerusalem, where an influx of tourists making pilgrimages and belonging to millennial cults will, says the FBI, add to the danger. That's because a lot of these people are cheerleaders for the apocalypse. There are, as some of you know, in Israel, Christians, Muslims, and Jewish groups alike, for whom Jerusalem's Temple Mount has been ground zero for potential catastrophe since the Six-Day War in 1967. One fringe of Jews living in acute messianic expectation in Israel believes the Muslim mosque there should be destroyed and replaced by the Third Temple. Earlier this year, members of an apocalyptic Christian cult, some of them with roots in the South, were deported from Israel back to America because they were suspected of planning violence in Jerusalem to hasten the return of Jesus and the apocalypse. And an American Christian evangelist in Jerusalem predicts almost with glee an apocalyptic war on Israeli soil so terrible that he says blood will flow down the Jordan River Valley, down the length of the Dead Sea, followed by the return of Christ. They are, as I say, cheerleaders for catastrophe. Now, of course, the exact timing of all this is anybody's guess. There's an organization in my home state of Texas which calls itself the House of Yahweh, whose founder is a former singer named Israel Hawkins. He predicts that before the year 2000 ends, 4/5 of the human race will perish as the world falls apart. But don't despair. The good Reverend has a plan of salvation for you. You will be spared if you pierce your ears, change your last name to Hawkins, and send 30% of your income to him in Abilene. The more things change, the more they don't change. But wild millennium expectations are nothing new. Through 2,000 years of Western history, millions of people have believed they were living in the last days. It's as if a dormant virus residing in human genes is activated when a millennium draws to an end. 1,000 years ago, the close of the first millennium of the Common Era was described as a time of terror and consternation at the prospect of the world's imminent destruction. The nightfall of the universe, it was called, was believed to be at hand. Christ was said to be coming again on the last day of the year 999 in Jerusalem at the very stroke of midnight, so that the roads to Jerusalem were filled with an immense, desolating army of pilgrims. They expect 4 million between the 1st of January and the end of the year 2000. Many people in those days feared the Antichrist would appear, precipitating a great battle between good and evil. Day after day, people fearfully scanned the sky. French nuns saw fiery armies fighting in the heavens. Others reported fire-breathing dragons in the clouds. Word spread of a mysterious disease known as St. Anthony's fire, which ate away at the human body and soul. And when people heard that the sky was raining blood, they knew for sure they were entering a time of violence and warfare. Now, all of this may sound to you here in Richmond little more than another Jerry Falwell sermon. But as we approach the third millennium of the Common Era, even the most resolutely secular sensibilities, as the Economist of London recently put it, can find itself being sucked into the collective cloud of hope and foreboding, the wavering of faith in human institutions, and the tendency to sudden panic that humanity has always been prone to display when it's felt a new era coming on. I mean, here I just brought a new magazine, Weekly World News, Billy Graham's Last Day's Warning, the end of the world is near. There's a lot of other things happening in the world that I don't know about. Bigamist claims he forgot he was already married. Dracula alive, and this is what he looks like. Jerry Springer. U.S. buys captured UFO from Russia. And then several pages on the last warning, the end of the world is near. And you read it, it reads like some of those tracts and sermons that were taken down 1,000 years ago. And of course, apprehensions over Y2K haven't made things any better. As you know, people have been concerned that computers will mistake 00 for the year 1900 and shut down, precipitating calamity. I saw a story in the paper this afternoon that the airlines have no bookings for the 31st of December and January 2nd. Religious visionaries are practically smacking their lips over the possibility of a Y2K horror. In one new book called Y2K, The Millennium Genesis, with which I spent the weekend, the villains are an American president and vice president drawn as caricatures of Clinton and Gore. They deliberately engineer a worldwide computer collapse on January 1 as a pretext for imposing martial law, suspending elections, and making themselves rulers for life. In the case of the Clinton figure, this isn't very long because he gets poisoned by his own vice president and literally goes to hell. But there's another and very important character in the book who is converted to Christianity, and America is saved from secular tyranny. Now, I'm not making this up. Books like this are wild bestsellers in a lot of religious quarters. Moreover, if you surf the religious cable stations, as I do as a journalist, you'll come across the Christian Reconstructionists who believe contemporary society must be destroyed and replaced by an era of strict biblical rule. One of their leaders was recently heard to say that Y2K will wipe out every national government in the West. Not just modify them, he said, destroy them. I honestly think, he said, the federal government will go under. I think the U.S. will break up the way the USSR did. Call me a dreamer. Call me an optimist. I wish I could get to him and tell him that I said to a friend of mine on Wall Street recently, I asked a friend of mine on Wall Street, how do you feel about the market? And he said, well, I'm optimistic. And I said, then why do you look so worried? And he said, because I'm not sure my optimism is justified. Well, the fact of the matter is that no one here has to be reminded that religion has a killing side. From the beginning, it's had a killing side. In the Genesis story, which we discussed in our series, the Genesis story to which three great faiths trace their origins, the first murder arises out of a religious act. Cain and Abel are brothers, family values, but they also are rivals for God's favor. And their rivalry leads to violence and ends in death. And once the pattern is established, it's played out in the story of Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, and down through the centuries and generation after generation of conflict between the children of God, so that the red thread of religiously spilled blood runs directly from east of Eden to the morning newspaper and the evening newscast. Virtually every armed conflict occurring on the planet today is explicitly driven by religious motives or by the memory traces of persisting religious conflict. So, we get fundamentalists in Algeria who want to make their country an Islamic theocracy, shooting teenage girls in the face for wearing a veil, and cutting professors' throats for teaching male and female students in the same classroom. In Israel, we get Muslim suicide bombers killing busloads of Jews, and a fanatical Jewish doctor with a machine gun mowing down 30 praying Muslims in a mosque. We get the young Orthodox Jew who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin, declaring on television, I remember seeing this, and being chilled the moment I heard him say, everything I did for the glory of God. And in Israel, you get death threats against reform and conservative leaders, and even death threats a few weeks ago against the Chief Justice of Israel's Supreme Court, and physical assaults by ultra-Orthodox extremists on men and women worshiping together at the Western Wall. In India tonight, Hindus and Muslims slaughter one another. And recently, Hindus have turned on Christians in India. In Afghanistan, Muslims slaughter each other, Sunnis against Shiites. In Pakistan, Christians are murdered after Muslims accuse them of black magic. In the Balkans, Orthodox Catholics and Muslims reenact old and bloody feuds. I have a documentary on in January on PBS. It's a 10-year look back at the Srebrenica massacre of 7,414 Muslim men in the town of Srebrenica soon after the Bosnian Serbs invaded. What was the battle cry for the Serbian Christians coming into this town and taking these thousands of Muslim men? It was, remember the Alamo. Remember a battle that took place 700 years ago, when in that battle the Muslims won. I mean, the cycle, the pendulum, the river, the traffic, the dynamic, the vengeance keep coming round and round and round. Here in America, religiously inspired terrorists bomb the World Trade Center in order to smite the great Satan. Timothy McVeigh blows up a federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, in part as revenge against the government for killing David Koresh and his followers. Benjamin Smith, a member of the World Church of the Creator, which believes whites are pitted in a battle for survival against blacks, Jews, and Asian Americans, goes on a shooting spree in Illinois and Indiana over the 4th of July weekend, killing 2 people and wounding 9. Groups calling themselves the Christian Identity Movement and the Christian Patriot League collect arsenals, and at a political convention in Dallas a few years ago, at a so-called Christian booth in the exhibit hall, you could buy an apron with 2 pockets. One for the Bible and one for a gun. Religion has a killing side. It was written in the founding document where it says, "The voice of thy brother's blood cries out," and that document itself is filled with murder, mayhem, and the arbitrary savagery of a vengeful God. Small wonder that William Penn said in the founding days of our government that to be furious in religion is to be furiously irreligious. So let's call the phenomenon we face with the coming of the new millennium PAT, that pre-millennial tension that provokes people to the most dire interpretation of events, from convulsions on the sun to mass murders in Waco, from Heaven's Gate in Rancho Santa Fe to the doom and gloom prognostications of Y2K. Whatever we call it, I want to suggest that we take a deep breath and count to 10. Instead of religion inflaming the doomsday mentality, let's reflect for just a few minutes on how religion can help us promote peace and pluralism, the respect for human rights, on a planet that is shrinking, where our next-door neighbors are less and less like us all the time. Here we need leadership. And here, too, the heart of the matter is ethical. How do we invoke the killing side of religion, or the healing side of religion? It's a crucial question because we're entering a new religious landscape in America. For most of our history, this country's religious discourse was dominated by white male Protestants of a culturally conservative European heritage, people like me. People like me had a virtual monopoly on the conversation, and dissenting visions of America, alternative visions of faith, rarely reach the mainstream. Recently, a friend of mine sent me a cartoon strip of two weirdos talking in a California diner. One weirdo says to the other, "Have you ever delved into the mysteries of Eastern religion?" And the second weirdo answers, "Yes, I was once a Methodist in Philadelphia." Well, once upon a time, that was about the extent of our exposure to the varieties of religious experience. But it's different. Now, our nation is being recreated right before our eyes. I see it because I travel constantly as a journalist, and I'm in community after community. More than 8 million immigrants have come to America in this decade alone. There are now more than 3,000 Korean congregations here, and more than 7,000 Latino churches. We have Hindu temples in Pittsburgh, Albany, and California's Silicon Valley. There are Sikh communities in Stockton and Queens, and Buddhist retreat centers in the mountains of Vermont and West Virginia. A Buddhist American died on the Challenger. Hindu Americans are managers at Procter & Gamble and Boston Edison and teach at the University of Richmond. A Muslim American is the mayor of a town in my home state of Texas. Muslims are said to be the fastest growing religion in the country. More Muslims now than Presbyterians or Episcopalians, and within a few years, perhaps more Muslims than Jews. At last count, there were 1,200 Islamic centers in this country whose congregations are becoming part and parcel of the American experience. You may have read that in my hometown, my current hometown of New York City earlier this year, passions were greatly inflamed when police wrongly killed a pious, clean-living Muslim immigrant with no criminal record. His name was Amadou Diallo, and he was cut down mistakenly by a fusillade of 41 shots. When his parents came from Africa, New Yorkers were shown aspects of Islam that our press and media had largely ignored. According to observers with whom I've talked, they were dignified, loyal, moderate, pious, ecumenical, conciliatory, and expressed great confidence in American justice. Their son's death precipitated a remarkable interreligious protest as Protestants and Jews joined Muslims in a coalition of conscience that New York City hadn't seen in decades. America, you see, has become a mosaic of identities. This means the claims of different stories and ideas impinge upon us from everywhere, because every religion conveys possible ways of expressing human existence and self-understanding, and because each can appear utterly incomprehensible to the other, we're facing what someone has called a contest of narratives. There are more meanings than we know what to do with, more stories than we could possibly want, but not too many stories to tell. Now, this would seem to me to be an enticing prospect in a country that revels in stories and celebrates their diversity. But the problem, as I just noted, is that religion has a way of turning sacred stories into flaming swords. As the religion scholar Elaine Pagel said in that same series I did with Joanne, she teaches religion at Princeton, has written a number of very important books. There's practically no religion I know of that sees other people in a way that affirms the other's choice. So religions circle their wagons. They become insular, pinched, paranoid. You see this most markedly in the narrative that Christian fundamentalists tell themselves about America. I don't mean only the bigotry of a Pat Robertson saying Jews are spiritually deaf and spiritually blind and comparing non-Christians to termites destroying institutions that have been built by Christians. I don't mean the tacky condensation of my old home, the Southern Baptist Convention's newest call for the conversion of Jews and Hindus. Nor do I mean the swollen by ignorance, swollen arrogance of a Jerry Falwell saying he doesn't know the identity of the Antichrist who will arrive to spread evil prior to the second coming, but he said he must be male and Jewish. I mean as well that collective self-delusion that gets acted out in the politics of paranoia. I saw this vividly and memorably one night a few years ago watching C-SPAN, back when the late imperial Newt Gingrich reigned in Washington. There he was, rousing the Christian coalition to a fever pitch by telling them that they're victims of Christian phobia. This in a country where the president, the vice president, the majority leader of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, and the minority leader of the House were not only Christians, but Baptists. Or maybe Newt Gingrich doesn't think the two are equated. I don't know. But you see, paranoia festers when people wake up and discover their neighborhood is changing. They wake up one morning, and suddenly they can no longer claim the higher ground of morality without defending it. And nothing so unnerves them as the realization that an opinion is not unarguable just because it's based on religious experience. For too many years now, these dogmatists have dominated our religious discourse. And much of my business, the mainstream media, has treated them as if they were the only authorities around on the subject of religion, democracy, and society. The rest of us were treated as spectators in a contest of narratives that became a pinched duel of absolutes between a strident right wing and their sputtering secular foes. America deserves better. Here, between 2 millennia, facing the never-ending work of democracy, the tedious, hard, perplexing, messy, and seemingly endless task of working through what kind of people are we going to become and what kind of communities are we going to live in, America deserves better. We need a new and richer conversation of democracy. Religion has to be part of that conversation. Religion is a wellspring of values reflecting different aspirations for our moral and political order. Religion as the exercise of free men and women trying to find meaning in a vast and expanding universe. Religion as the interpretation of life itself. But how? How, in the real world of democracy, can I hold my religious truth to be the truth when everyone else sees truth differently? I put this question not long ago to the renowned scholar of comparative religion, Huston Smith. Some of you were talking earlier about that series and using the cassettes, The Wisdom of Faith with Huston Smith. Over a long time in university posts from MIT to Berkeley and as a pilgrim in the world, Huston Smith has explored the essence of the world's great religions. He's still going at it at 80. I spent a delightful weekend with him about 4 weeks ago. In one stretch of 3 hours, he just talked intently and passionately about the glories of a world that is so diverse and a world that's so rich in variety that he's sorry he's 80 and he's going to see it and miss seeing it come to fruition. But anyway, when I asked him on that series, Huston, how can I hold my truth to be true when everyone else sees truth differently? He thought a moment. One of those rare moments on television where you can actually see someone thinking before talking. And then he answered, we listen. We listen. We listen as alertly to the other person's description of reality as we hope they listen to ours. We listen. This frightens some people. They fear that hearing what others have to say will lead to the loss of their own distinctive tradition. They fear that they'll have to shed the uniqueness of their own beliefs to embrace a flimsy ecumenicism which reduces all religion to saying the same thing. But you know, that hasn't been my experience. In the series that I did on Genesis, in which Professor Al-Hibiri participated, it was a simple series by television standards, 7 people facing each other in a circle of conversation as if around a campfire. A simple series, yes, but none of my work on television until then had generated more media response prior to broadcast than those 10 discussions of Genesis. Cover of Time magazine, cover of Newsweek International, major articles in every newspaper and magazine in the country. The interesting thing, the astonishing thing to me was that all over the country, people organized themselves into groups so that they could watch the programs together and then talk about them afterwards. I mean, one single organization of older Americans signed up 1 million people just for the purpose of watching and then talking about what they had seen. Our participants in that program were not from the same neighborhood. You know, talking with people who agree with you is like jogging in a cul-de-sac. I mean, it is. So we sought out people from different backgrounds, faiths, professional fields, age, and gender. Our final lineup included visual artists, a literary critic, novelists, theologians, biblical scholars, a journalist, an editor, ministers and rabbis, a college president, a clinical psychologist, 2 Muslims, a Hindu writer, musician, and a Republican. Just kidding, I was checking to see if you were listening. Above all, we wanted to see if it's possible to talk about God in public without politicizing religion or polarizing the neighborhood. We hope to show that you can disagree passionately with people about things that matter without surrendering your own principled beliefs or going for your neighbor's throat. That we can engage with others in serious conversation about the most deeply felt subjects, and that we can truly challenge each other, teach each other, and learn from each other. Often we disagreed, and the more we talked, the more we disagreed. We were constantly reminded that differences between faiths are real, not to be papered over for the sake of a nice protocol. But we also discovered that people with deep, intractable differences make for good listening. The modern piety has been that the purpose of interfaith dialogue is to get at the core of what we have in common. That's valuable. But I'm far more interested in what is truly other about others. Not how we are alike, but how we differ. Difference, you see, is the basis for comparison. Difference is the way we learn. When you listen to the loves of others, to what is not dreamt of in your own philosophy. Hearts, minds, and lives can be profoundly touched. That's been my experience. I believe I'm no less a Christian for having come to see that all the great religions grapple with things that matter, that each may come out at a different place, that each points to a lived human experience, and that each and every one of them deserves attention for the wisdom they have gathered from different angles of vision. Jews have taught me about God as the awesome other, about the imperative of justice as the basis for a moral order, about passion in the search for meaning. From Buddhists, I've learned about contemplation and the radical impermanence of things, the noble silence of being, and the mind awake. I'm not sure that I would have come through my heart surgery 4 years ago if it hadn't been for what Buddhists taught me about the mind awake. From Muslims, I've learned about surrender, the beauty of the mystical union with God. From Confucianists, the relationship of inner harmony to the public ethos, the relationship of our own personal values to ethics, and the importance of nurturing our second nature. Hindus have taught me about realms of gold hidden deep in the depths of our hearts. Have any of these insights come at the expense of the confidence I have in my own story that shaped my own life, the Christian story, the Christian narrative? I don't think so. And I must say, there is something terribly liberating about no longer being tone deaf to what others have to report about their experience of God. No one has been more helpful on this than my friend Nasr. A Muslim scholar of world distinction, Syed Hossein Nasr is the university professor of Islamic studies at George Washington University. He's been watching America change over the past quarter century by wave after wave of immigration, creating what he calls a dynamic mix of cultures, traditions, beliefs, and aspirations. It's a discombobulating experience, he says, like riding a crowded bus on a bumpy road. It tests our mettle. The temptation of pluralism is to reduce religion to the least common denominator, he says, a melange of superficial and borrowed opinions that lead to relativism and even nihilism, where everybody believes everything and no one believes anything. But there's another way, says Nasr. Suppose you hold with your conviction to your center the reality of your own spiritual experience and journey, and I to mine. But that we recognize that each of our faiths is as concerned as the other with the meaning of human life, with the significance of the moral in human action, with the search for a transcendent dimension to human experience. Suppose we acknowledge that while someone belonging to another tradition with her own spiritual center is not one of us, but nevertheless is one of God's. We learn to live then in a world with no center and many. We learn, well, Kathleen Norris, one of my favorite writers and poets, puts it this way in one of her poems: we are all God's chosen now. Then in the next breath she prays, God help us because we are. The call, you see, is not to pride. The call is to the very core of ethics, humility. That great Jewish teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel, got it right, I think, when he said, no religion is an island. We're all involved with one another. Spiritual betrayal on the part of one affects the faith of all. So yes, here, on the eve of a new millennium, some people are obsessed with omens of destruction. But beyond those visions of possible ruin and desolation, there are inklings of more hopeful opportunities. I believe this new century could be a time to heal wounds and build a more just world. Religion can be the ally of a confident future. In offering respect to others, in seeking to understand them as we ourselves seek to be understood, in being true to our own values, but humble toward one another. Each of us strengthens the fabric of democracy and hastens the future we will share together. You're a marvelous audience. Thank you for letting me come, and thank you for listening. Joanne says it's time for the questions, and she'll let me know when class is over. All right? There's a microphone here, and there's one here. Who's going to be first? What? No questions? We don't have any aspiring journalists here? Yes.
Well, thank you very much. You're wonderful. Thank you for all that you've done.
Thank you.
Tell us about Joseph Campbell.
Joseph Campbell was, for 38 years, a teacher at Sarah Lawrence. His field, like Houston Smith's, was comparative religion and comparative literature. His first book was written trying to interpret the mythological symbols in James Joyce's Ulysses, and then he went on over the course of a long life to read everything and try to synthesize it and try to come to understand the great mythologies of the world, the great myths, the great spiritual truths that we tell ourselves about our relationship to the universe. 1980, I'd read his most noted book, Hero of the Thousand Faces, when I was at the University of Texas, and didn't know much about him after that. Forgot about that book largely, although I'd pull it off the shelf, I remember once or twice, and looked up a story in it. Then I saw in the New York Times that he was coming to the National Arts Club to receive an award. I also read a story that George Lucas, in making the first Star Wars movies, had been greatly influenced by Joseph Campbell's work and had asked Campbell to come and look at some of his ideas that later became the movie Star Wars, the first trilogy of Star Wars. So I saw he was coming. I called him up. I was doing a series of weekly hour interviews on PBS. Then I asked him to be interviewed. I sat down with him at the Museum of Natural History. As a 9-year-old child, Joseph Campbell had been taken into the Museum of Natural History by his father and exposed to the Indian parts of that museum, these great totems and masks and canoes, all the artifacts that have come down to us from the indigenous people. And his imagination exploded at the age of 9 with those symbols and and why did these symbols exist? Who made these? Who were these people? So I called him up and said, let's do an interview. We sat in the Museum of Natural History for about 3 hours. I took that material, edited it down into 2 1-hours, and put them on the air. Well, I hadn't had a response like that to anything except perhaps to the Mortimer Adler series. 10,000 people wrote, and I couldn't understand quite why. It was a good conversation. He was an interesting man, but somehow what he said touched people. I had a letter from Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, because in that series, in that first interview, he had talked about the power of ritual in our society and what happens to a society when rituals disappear. And he talked about the Kennedy funeral after the assassination of the president as one of the great times of ritual in American history. He said, I never, said Joseph Campbell, felt more an American than when I watched and participated in that ritual on television. And there was the widow in black in the traditional Greek garb, playing the traditional mythological role of the grieving widow, carrying the griefs of the nation on her shoulders and in her heart. So Mrs. Kennedy saw that, wrote me a letter and said, "You should do him again. He really has some things to say." Well, a number of years went by. I went to CBS for 5 years. But then I decided it was time to do him again. So I wrote him and said, let's get together and let's do a series. So George Lucas made his ranch available, Skywalker Ranch, and I went out over the summer of 85 and 86 and taped 26 hours with Campbell, edited them to 6, and put them on PBS in 1987. Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth. Again, the most extraordinary response. Mrs. Kennedy called and said, let's print the transcripts as a book. I said, nobody wants to sit and read the Q&A of two guys sitting in ties talking about like that. She said, oh, no, we've got to print the book. And I said, well, okay, go ahead and do it. They printed it. Over 1 million copies were sold of that book. The series has been seen over and over again. People come up to me today, people in their 60s and people 20, and they say, my life was changed by this man. He was a great teacher, but more than that, he went to a depth of understanding about the journey we're on, unlike any I've ever heard before. Example, I said to him, we were talking about the meaning of faith. I said, are you a man of faith? He said, oh, I don't have faith. I don't need faith. He didn't say I didn't have. He said, I don't need faith. I have experience. And it's true. You know it's true that very often religion becomes an impediment to the experience. Religion becomes a reason to talk about God but not to experience God. Not to talk about ultimate reality but not to taste ultimate reality. Another moment, we were talking about, the meaning of life this time. And he said, what's the meaning of a flea? What's the meaning of a flower? He said, it's not the meaning of things that count. It's the experience of being alive that counts. And he said, I have rapture. I have joy. I have experience. He said, maybe meaning will come, but I don't want to miss the experience in the search for meaning. The rapture of being alive. Anyway, he talked like that. We talked about God. We talked about death, birth, and resurrection. We talked about creation, how all the great religions have very similar stories of a creative God creating the universe, how many great religions have messiahs and births and resurrection, virgin births and resurrection, and something very deep in the human psyche that religion is attempting to express and expose. And it touched a serious. The reason it touched a nerve in the country, I think, is because he gave us a new vocabulary for talking about the religious experience that went beyond doctrine and creed and dogma. Now, doctrine and creed or dogma are important for people who can't think in other ways, who need to organize their sentiments and ideas. But it's not the only experience that is there, or otherwise millions of young people, about the late 70s, millions of young people were leaving the traditional churches. My own 3 children, all of whom are deeply spiritual children, left the church that I grew up in and that I had raised them in because they were no longer satisfied. Their experience in the world was no longer satisfied by the doctrine and dogma. They're coming back now, but they had to go in a search that was not satisfied by the uncritical acceptance of a tradition that they had to test themselves before they could really know that behind the expression was a reality. So he touched that nerve. I'll tell you, I'm taking too long on this, but a year after that series aired, I was coming from lunch at La Rambas, a restaurant on 8th Avenue in New York, near my office. Came out of the restaurant, walked up the street. Young African-American woman was coming toward me. And, television makes us intimate strangers. You think you know the people you see on television, and somehow I have a sense that I know the people who are watching on television. So we sort of passed like this, and then we each turned and looked, and she said, Mr. Moyers, and I said, yes. She said, do you have a minute? I said, sure. She said, well, let me just tell you something. So I stood over and put my foot on the water hydrant, and she told me this story, which I'm going to condense into about a minute. But she had come to New York from the Midwest, had wanted to be an actress, had had small parts, bit parts, like most people in trying to get into acting, but was a waitress in a day job, like most women who want to be actresses in New York, or most men. Had this, but the big break hadn't come, not even a significant break. She'd hung on, though. She said, I wanted to be an actress. She met a young man. They were engaged to be married. Then in succession, her father died. Her fiance left her and married another woman, and she lost the one part that she thought would be the part that would give her her break. She said, I came home one night. I lived right over there. She pointed to the apartment. Ironically, it was the same building which in 1970, when I started in television, we had used for our editing facilities, and that was a condominium. So she said, I came home. I had it. I was finished. She said, I pulled down the window, the blinds in the window. I poured a big, stiff glass of bourbon. I turned on the gas in the little burner in my studio apartment, and I was going to have my exit. She said, I was lying on the couch, and she said, I'd left the television on when I'd rushed out in the morning to my job, and I heard these voices talking about these stories and the meaning of life. And she said, I heard this man say, the meaning is not what I'm after. I'm after the experience of being alive. He said, I want to experience this moment, the only moment I've had. Joe Campbell's definition of eternity was this moment, because it's the moment between the past, which we can't change, and the future, which we can't know. So this moment, he said, is the only time you really have. And she said, that brought me up, she said, and I recognized your voice. And then I heard the announcer say, Bill Moyers will be back next week with more conversation with Joseph Campbell. She said, I was very curious, she said. So I got up, I went over and turned off the gas burner, I poured out the bourbon, and I opened the blinds in the window. And she said, I realized, and I was there the next week, and I realized that I didn't have to be an actress, but I did want to be alive. He was a great teacher. And isn't that what all good and great teachers do? They make us feel passionate about the moment, about our lives, and about life as a continuing course in adult education, which is what it is. That's what Joseph Campbell was and did.
Mr. Moyers, I just wanted to comment. I think that your words are so inspirational and very apropos for the situation in Northern Ireland, where I participated in a peace and conflict resolution semester last year. But because that's a situation where people are putting religion aside, and almost they have to do that to just create a living situation. But on another note, I'd like you to comment on the public's reaction to your Poverty in America series, which I thought was very inspirational. And
thank you. It's very hard to get us to pay attention today to the poor. The poor are sort of off our agenda. I think that often happens in times of rampaging prosperity, which we have today, even though despite this prosperity, the inequality in the country continues to grow. I have another special coming up in March called Surviving the Good Times, a report on working families. We've been filming it for 10 years in Milwaukee with two families, an African-American family and a white working-class family, as both fathers lost their jobs in that first great wave of downsizing in 1989. And now they're about where they were economically, but with both husband and wife working, and at a real cost to the attention and time they've provided their children, and to their time for community and church activities. And over the years, I've done a number of series like this. The response in the beginning in the 70s was good and positive. The response of late has been somewhat indifferent, and we don't get the best audiences, the largest audiences, and we don't get the best response. There's something about not wanting to face this reality, this denial in the country today, that actually has an effect on the response to those series. Now, the other side of it is that as I travel, I find so many individual people and congregations of different faiths getting involved in trying to do something about the situation with the working poor and poor people. A lot of churches, mosques, and synagogues are getting involved in trying to help women getting off of welfare, and that's a very encouraging sign. I sense a rise of idealism in the country, although television and radio, with the exception of public television, public radio, don't pay much attention to what's going on. So I'll get back around to that subject. Yes, you had a question?
Mr. Moyers, I'm a student at one of the local seminaries, and I wanted to thank you for the food for thought you've given me that will last me at least through January 1st.
Well, with the attention span today, I consider that a considerable victory.
As you were speaking, and speaking of religious pluralism and the interfaith dialogue, I was reminded of a discussion just today with a student in a theology class I was in, where he could not understand my desire to engage in dialogue with Buddhists and Muslims and Hindus and Confucianists and any person of faith. And I tried quite rather ineptly to explain it to him. I was wondering if you might have any words of wisdom on how we might convey the importance of the interfaith dialogue to those who see it as almost an evil.
Almost what?
Almost an evil. See it,
I don't know how you reach certain people. I really don't. There's certainly more openness today than there was when I was growing up. When I was growing up, we hardly talked to Methodists, much less Jews and Muslims. But my advice is that there's not much you can do for it. You can't make somebody, you come to an insight before he or she is prepared for it. All you can do is do what you do in such a way that causes that person to say, something's going on there, I'd like to find out about it. So there are people with whom you can have this dialogue. You can keep inviting this person or those people and ask them to come, maybe by chance, or someone said coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. Maybe coincidence will bring them. But don't waste your time, frankly, on people whose ears are closed. There are others whose ears are opening, and those are the people you want to share your experience with. Yes.
Good evening. I'm another seminary student here in town, and wanted to thank you for your comments coming to speak with us here tonight. I especially appreciated your remarks on describing Joseph Campbell, your conversations with him in terms of embracing life and embracing the experience. And I think that in these days, perhaps as a reaction to the coming changing of the millennium, or possibly in reaction to our increasingly scientific and technological world, people seem to be searching for a resolution of an inherent seeking for God, an inherent need for spirituality. And in terms of embracing life, there are many different rituals that we may mark our paths of progress, different rituals we may choose to mark our progress through our lives. And I was hoping that you would remark tonight on your upcoming series on our own terms, in terms of embracing the experience of death and dying.
Thank you for reminding me of that, for reminding me of a larger point, which is that we are whole human beings. We're material beings. We must eat and drink. We're physical beings. We're also economic beings. We must work and produce, create. We're also spiritual people because we do have this deep yearning for something that is more than the sum of our material appetites. And that spiritual side of us is very, very real. And I say to my atheist friends, as I say to the fundamentalists, you can't deny that there is this deep spirit. But we are total human beings. Well, a couple of years ago, I'm a journalist, by the way. I am an expert in nothing. We journalists are licensed to explain things we don't understand, and I think that's why I do what I do. There's so much I don't understand. I'm a perpetual pupil. I was a very good pupil in high school and college. I would make a sad scholar, but as a student, I'm terrific in loving to listen and learn. So I'm a journalist doing these things, not because I feel any great sense of mission about them. And there's a certain humility that comes in being a journalist. It's a great story, and I'm going to get to your question in a minute, but there's a great story about Einstein, who dies, of course, and goes to heaven, and he's introduced to the 4 roommates he will have for the rest of eternity. And one of his roommates says, "Oh, Dr. Einstein, I'm so glad to meet you." He said, "I want you to know I have an IQ of 186. And Einstein says, "Marvelous. Tonight at dinner, you and I will discuss the electrodynamic equivalences of mc squared inherent in the molecular dimensions of interstellar particles." Next man comes up to him and says, "Dr. Einstein, I'm so happy to be your roommate, too. I have an IQ of 160. And Einstein says, "Terrific. Tomorrow night at dinner, we'll discuss the thermokinetic theories of induction affecting photovelocity tendencies of magnetic ironics." Great. Next man comes up and says, "Doctor, I'm so glad to meet you. This is a thrill." He said, "I have an IQ of 140. Dr. Einstein says, "Wonderful. Friday night, you and I will discuss American politics." And then the last man comes up to him and says, "This is the greatest honor I could ever have, but I want you to know I only have an IQ of 120. Einstein says, "That's all right. You and I will find many things to talk about, but first tell me, how long were you a journalist?" I do these subjects because I'm interested in them, and I see them as news. I've got a series on right now about poetry, because I think poetry is big news in America today. There's a resurgence of public poetry going on. It's called Fooling with Words, and then it's a series of half-hour portraits of some major American poets called The Sounds of Poetry. There's a little book out with it that we've done called Fooling with Words. But poetry's big news, news from the gene pool, so to speak, news that goes beyond the 6 o'clock news. Well, 2 years ago, I began to notice people were talking about death and dying again in professional circles, in medical circles. A subject that had been taboo, about which we'd been in denial, was suddenly cropping up here and there. And as I say, I travel, so I hear these things that you hear in isolation or in particulars. And it takes a while until those particulars congregate and become a critical mass. So I came back and said, from one trip, and said to my staff, there's something going on in this whole effort of improving the care for the dying. I heard about an organization called Last Acts that's working to improve the conditions for the dying. Then my own baby boomer son said to me, we did a series last year called Close to Home about addiction and recovery. He was 10 years in the throes of an addiction, drugs and alcohol. We almost lost him 3 times. He came up out of it. We worked it through. He's terrific today. He's vice president of the rehabilitation clinic where he started his treatment. So I decided I wanted to do a series about addiction recovery, a 5-part series that ran on PBS. And in the interviewing we did, he and I were appearing to promote the series. Somebody asked him about what difference does it make to be sober. And he said, I have all the same issues that I did before. It's just that I don't have to deal with them through the stupor of alcoholism. He said, for example, one of my issues is, and he'd never mentioned this to me, he was 39 at the time, one of my issues is my father's death. How am I going to adjust to a world without my father? And I began to think about that. He was thinking, baby boomers are thinking about, 5 years ago, according to George Gallup, baby boomers were thinking about their retirement. Today they're thinking about mortality, theirs and their parents. And that got me to thinking. Then my own mother, I was in my mother's room the moment she stopped aging and started dying. There was a noticeable difference. A cloud came across her face. Her jaw shifted and then hardened like wax after a candle goes out. It took her 2 years to die, but she had stopped aging and was dying, and there was a difference. And I had a difficult time during this period with her. I didn't know about dying. I mean, death has been a frequent visitor to my house. My first image of my grandfather was of his corpse at the age of 5, laid out on the table in the parlor of his home in Oklahoma. My mother lost twins. My mother lost a sister born after I was born. My mother lost her oldest son, my brother, at age 39. I mean, death has always been a part of a frequent visitor to our household, but I had never really seen death. I'd seen the dead, but I hadn't seen dying. And I watched my mother die. It took her 2 years. I had difficult problems with her. How much medication, how little medication. How much comfort, how much consciousness. Wrestle with doctors, change doctors. Wrestle with nurses, change nurses. Wrestle with myself, couldn't change me because I was the only one left. And all of this came together, and 18 months ago, 24 months ago, 20 months ago, I said, we've got to do a series on end-of-life care, on dying, death and dying. So it takes me about a year. I raise every penny for every production that I do on public television. It took me about a year to raise the money. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, a great foundation, is supporting it. We've been filming for 9 months. I have one more shooting to do this weekend in Kansas City. We've been following the story of a marvelous 55-year-old doctor, a child pediatrician, a pediatric surgeon, who was diagnosed with cancer at age 50, thought he had a year to go, only a year to go, lived 5 years, wrote a wonderful series of meditations on it. We've been following his story. I'm going out to interview his widow on Sunday. Now we're editing that. It'll be a 6-hour series that will air next September 10th, 11th, 12th on PBS. You'll hear about it because we don't just do production, we do outreach. My wife, who runs our company, and we believe television has to have legs. That if it doesn't have legs, it disappears after it airs. So we're spending right now the next year. We will spend the next year working with church groups, synagogues, mosques, professional groups, nursing groups, medical groups, educational groups, involving them in the outreach of that series. It's about, the last time I looked, the death rate was the same as it had been 1,000 years ago, 1 per person. And this asks the universal question. This asks the universal question, is it possible to have a good death? We cannot avoid death, but is it possible to have a good death? And it is in 2 respects. No one, with rare exception, no one need die today in pain if we can do the right thing about treating pain. And you'll see some examples of how we do it. Now, pain is not the same thing as suffering. You can be free of pain and still have existential suffering, the loss of your loved ones, the question about what comes next. And so you'll see us deal with those situations, existential suffering. The meaning of death, what does it mean? And the whole thing is aimed toward trying to see what people are doing around the country to improve care for the dying. So that's a long-winded answer to your question about this series. By the way, I have a special on November 22nd, next Tuesday night on Frontline, called Justice for Sale, looking at the influence of money on judicial races around the country. That's one of my favorite subjects, money in politics. So I hope you will take a look at that. You had a question. And I'll make my answer shorter, I promise you, because some of you have to go.
Well, you may have already answered it. Thanks also for coming tonight. Is secularism dead, or is there a place for sacred?
What dead?
Secularism.
Secularism dead?
Yeah, or is there a place for sacred secularism, where indeed, life becomes alive in the midst of, our urban environment and the culture we live in? I like to hope that all of the symbols aren't simply manipulated now by, those who manipulate the symbols.
Yes, that's a very good point. Is secularism dead, and is there a place for sacred secularism? That is the secular attitude that we don't know, but I will live my life as ethically and honorably as I can. Well, according to George Gallup again, 1 out of 5 Americans, 20% of us, do not believe in God. We do not practice a religious discipline. Some of those people are among my best friends. I really admire them and respect them. They do not believe, they do not think that there is a way rationally to embrace ideas of God. Although this interview with this doctor that I was just telling you about, he comes to think of death as God. And he goes through a fascinating journey of his own. But I think it's a mistake to say that everybody is or ought to be like the rest of us, and that I have great regard for those people like Steven Weinberg, who won the Nobel the Nobel Prize for Physics, who was in World of Ideas, who simply are atheists. There's a convention of them in San Antonio 4 weeks ago. They call it the Association for Rational Thinking, and they reject religious symbols, and they don't want to live under them. It's in a way it's unfair to them to live in a society that requires any kind of, well, in fact, I think America's great contribution to political science happened right here in Virginia. The notion of free conscience, a free church and a free state. The whole idea that Jefferson and Mason and Madison expounded, that belief cannot be coerced, and I cannot be taxed to pay for somebody else's belief. So that implies, as these people who met in San Antonio said, they asked me to come and do a documentary about it. I couldn't because I was filming for Death and Dying. But they said, you don't have to be religious to have a conscience. That is true. These are deeply, highly ethical people. And it's this freedom of thought means freedom from religion, if that's the way your thought takes you. And that's a great tradition in this country, and it was in no small part because of what happened right here in your native state. Yes?
Thank you. When that young man spoke a little bit ago about not knowing what to say to someone who was deaf to what was going on, I was reminded of a workshop I went to several years ago. I'll call it a New Age workshop, where the facilitator said that there is so much light coming into the planet that the only thing we can do now is not talk things over. It's too late to talk things over. What we can do is send light. And that was very interesting to me because I was very involved in conflict resolution and reconciliation and talking things over. And since then I have heard other people, like one woman said she has had trouble with the sun in California, and so every morning she sits down and sends him light. And he's doing much better for whatever reason. And someone else said perhaps that is New Age parenting. And New Age, another way to work things out. In a way, it's the same as prayer, I suppose. And of course, the important thing in any dialogue, one important thing is the presence of the person, and what is the intention of the person. And I'm also reminded of a remark of the Dalai Lama, who said, "My true religion is kindness." So I wonder how you see that aspect in terms of dialogue, the intention, the light, and all of that.
Well, I find that revelation and insight, and Joseph Campbell talked about how we find ourselves being suddenly helped by invisible hands. And I think there are invisible hands, and there are different things for different people who come at moments when we may or may not be open to them. And the human species is so varied that it's impossible almost to generalize about it, except to say everybody will die. It's hard to say how so many different ones of us perceive God, pray, reach out to our loved ones. So I say that as long as it's not hurting someone else, we have to honor that person's conviction that she is living in her own light and must live by that light. Let's take, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Moyers. I feel so honored at being here tonight and meeting you. I feel so honored because I grew up here in Richmond in the 40s, and I can give you at least 900 reasons why I'm glad that I'm here in this very spot today. But one of the things that has been on my mind is I'm referring to a niece. She was 28, and there was a young man that I wanted her to meet. He worked at a bank, and I thought he had a very good job, and I gave her that information, and she said, well, is he saved? And I didn't know what to say to her. The only thing I could think of was what Maya Angelou says when somebody says to her, I'm saved. She says, already? And I'd like your opinions on what are your thoughts about being saved, or what is the apropos thing to think or say when that question comes up?
My answer is a serious answer. For you, yes. For me, it's a different experience and therefore requires a different vocabulary. But for you, if what you mean by being saved is turns you toward an ethical and principled and satisfying life, more power to you. I find mine in other ways. And I can't say that I am saved except as she might mean it in that particular culture where she grew up, where I went through the same kind of experiences. What I would mean by saved, she would have no way of grasping, and therefore it would be unfair for me to judge her, even as it would be unfair for her to judge me. Judge not is a very important ethical imperative, it seems to me.
Well, that's the way I look at it, because I think that it's an ongoing process. To say that even if I felt saved a year ago, I'm not 100% sure that I can say I'm saved today. But it's an ongoing process, such as life, in living, and the way you treat people, and the way that you want to do what's good in your heart and what you feel most comfortable with.
Well, evangelical Christians, of course, mean by that they've had a personal born-again experience with Jesus Christ, who in their experience is the incarnation of God's love. That is a very difficult concept to explain to people who don't come up in that culture, who haven't had that experience. I mean, all you have to do is read William James' Varieties of Religious Experience to see. I did a documentary back when Jimmy Carter was talking about born again. All my friends in the Northeast had no idea what he was talking about. And so I did a documentary on CBS trying to explain it, and we failed because we cannot do justice to a subject that is so interior and is so culturally defined and so personally experienced that it's impossible to find a common language. That's why it's difficult to talk about deep spiritual experiences, because we don't have a language that is in common that does justice to the variety of our religious experiences. So all you can do is love her and encourage her to stay open to the world. She may redefine what she means by that, as a lot of us have as time goes on. Yes. If you have to leave, I don't mind you walking out. It's happened to me before.
I doubt it. I very much appreciated your work through the years, and I want to preface my remarks with that. Listening to you speak tonight and seeing how many people showed up, and you don't know how many were turned away because there just wasn't room to seat them all. It's obvious that many people care about long-term solutions and really functional ideas that go through time, and yet when we go outside and we read the paper, we see functionally what's possible. It seems like we lose a whole lot of territory. And I wonder what you think is possible. What could we do as individuals or as groups to keep our leaders from falling to these really short-term solutions and teach the ethical principles so that they won't accept those short-term solutions. So often they do, and I know a lot of people won't be reached by you and your message or won't have any interest in this whole area. But for the possible 10% of the population that will, who probably run the country anyway, it would be very useful to know how to articulate these things so that we can have a little better place to share our community. I feel like we could do a lot better, but I'm not sure how to operationalize.
I don't either. I know that you have to create a zone in your own life. Cicely Bach, who is a marvelous ethicist, has written a book on creating a zone of your own, a zone of peace where within that zone you do everything you can to serve your values and affect the world affirmatively. And I think that while that's seemingly evasive to your question, it is the only answer I can give in a pluralistic and democratic society. That is that each of us within our zone of peace does what we can to serve those personal and social values that give us buoyancy and stability in our own life. And I do see that. I met some young people here tonight, some young women from Petersburg who are going to be social workers. And when I just see the passion in their eyes to be valuable, to be helpful, to serve other people, my faith is restored. And each of us find things like that and can find things. And then you enlarge that zone a little bit because you discover someone else is also trying to do something similar. And it's almost like the ocean receding and discovering an isthmus there that you share. And then it joins together and gets larger and larger. That's hopefully what political parties are for, and social movements and professional organizations. In the long run, I really believe we'll make no significant progress as a society until we do something about the issue, my favorite passion, of money in politics, because politics has become an arms race with missiles, with money doing the work of missiles. And our two political parties are funded in such a way that good men and women wind up serving a bad system in which the contributor, the donor, has more access to and more influence over the incumbent than the voters do. And so therefore, our politicians are unable to do unpopular long-term solutions because they pay a short-term price in the contributors and donors shifting their funding in the next election to somebody else. So until we can, if anybody's going to own the politicians, we should. That's why I am a staunch advocate of what's called the clean money option to public election. Private money should not influence public officials. It's just morally wrong. And until we find a way to do that, and there, Maine, Massachusetts, Arizona, an independent state like Maine, a liberal state like Massachusetts, and a libertarian state like Arizona have all in the last 3 years passed what's called the clean money option, which does not eliminate private money. If you want to run and spend your own money, or you want to raise money from other people, fine. But public funding enables your competitors who forego private financing to receive money from a public fund. Now, I know people bridle and say, well, the public will never pay for that. That's just not true. Worth magazine, Money magazine, which is not a socialist organ, estimates that it costs every one of you $1,900 a year in subsidies and loopholes and tax breaks that are the result of the undue influence of big money over politics. It only costs you $5 a year to fund all the federal elections here in Virginia. It would only take another $5 to fund the state elections. The judge in Maine 2 weeks ago upheld the constitutionality of every aspect of the initiative that was passed there last year. So the Constitution is in favor of this kind of approach. And so my answer, in part, to the political paralysis that we face today is that we have to reduce the impact of private money over public elections. in the meantime, you do where you can what you can to, Thoreau had a wonderful saying. He said, to affirm the quality of the day is the highest of the arts. And I believe that's true. Whether you are teaching, whether you're working in your business and performing an important, being ethical, whether it's visiting the sick, whether it's being kind to the poor or helping the poor, whatever it is, each of us can affect the quality of the day. You do the best journalism you can, you do the best corporation executive that you can, be the best teacher that you can. That's that zone of peace where each of us is able to affirm our values, even if the world doesn't embrace them. I don't know any other way to live except to get up every morning anticipating a confident future and doing what I can that day to try to bring it about. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I don't think he's coming out.
You are very, very kind, but I must tell you my favorite cartoon from the last 20 years in the New Yorker is the king who's just been crowned, and he calls his retinue around him. He says, I only want 3 things in the course of my reign: wisdom, humility, and media exposure. I've got the media exposure. The wisdom and humility has to come elsewhere. Thank you very much.